This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, and welcome to our remote learning produce food safety webinar series. My name is Ashley Skinner, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. This series is funded by the USDA and is led by our PI, Dr. Michelle Danieluk from the University of Florida Citrus Research and Education Center located in Lake Alfred, Florida. This project is in collaboration with Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University with PI Dr. Harriet Paul, located in Tallahassee, Florida. Our overall goal with this community outreach project is to develop innovative and engaging remote learning produce food safety curriculum that is highly accessible to diverse growers, particularly small and beginning farmers, in order to equip them with increased food safety awareness and the skills to adopt proven food safety risk reduction practices. To do so, one of our aims is to deliver instructor-led workshop webinars to diverse audiences across Florida and the US. Today, we have two participants from Florida Agricultural Mechanical University, FAMU. One is from the School of Business and Industry, and the other is from the School of the Environment. Joining us in our discussion, we have Taquasha Freeman and Walker Marshall. And finally, we have Taylor O'Bannon from the University of Florida. She is a state specialized extension agent and is our featured presenter to teach us about worker health and training. Take it away, Taylor.
Hi, Ashley. Thank you for having me today. Thank you all for being here. As she said, we're going to be covering worker health and hygiene and also worker training. So let's get right into it. Why is worker health and hygiene and worker training important? Well, we know that workers play a major role in implementing food safety on our farms. They are often our first line of defense when it comes to identifying and preventing food safety issues from occurring. And they're really those boots on the ground, day-to-day barriers to contamination and food safety risk. However, it's important to understand that workers can also contribute to food safety risk if they're not following policies that support good food safety principles. So let's get into some of the risks that workers can pose to the farm. Workers can carry human pathogens. So certainly as we are all susceptible to foodborne illness, workers can also be susceptible to foodborne illness and carry those pathogens onto the farm. Human pathogens such as hepatitis A and norovirus are commonly associated with food handlers, and these outbreaks have been seen in like frozen berries, fresh produce, and are often directly linked to those food workers on the farm. The other way that workers can contribute to contamination is that they can spread human pathogens. So just as they may harbor those pathogens, they can spread them through their saliva, mucus, blood, and through the most common route, which is the fecal-oral route. But they can also spread contamination that maybe they did not introduce as a foodborne illness. Maybe there's other factors of introduction, which we'll talk about, but they do play a role or can play a role in spreading that contamination through their hands, clothing, and shoes. So first, let's talk about the different contamination sources that we can see on the farm and talk about how workers are important to either mitigate those or can also play a role in spreading those. So this is a slide from the Produce Safety Alliance curriculum, and this is version 1.2, module 1, slide 21 for anyone who is interested in looking up this slide. But these are the routes of contamination that the Produce Safety Alliance has cited to introduce contamination risk on our farm. And so you can see that they have cited as humans as playing an important role of how contamination sources can be introduced. But there's other sources that play a risk, right? So soil, water, buildings, and animals. But it's important to understand that humans also play a role in interacting with all of these other possible contamination sources. And so when you are thinking about how your workers move throughout your farm, how workers may interact with all of these sources, it's important to think about your farm food safety policies and making sure that they support principles which can prevent those risks. So let's get into some routes of contamination that humans can contribute. So of course, we talked about the fecal oral route can be is often the most prevalent source of humans actually introducing contamination on the farm. And so we'll talk about why using the toilet properly is important. Another area where humans can introduce or spread contamination on the farm is through our clothing and footwear. So oftentimes our clothing can be considered a zone 1 surface or a food contact surface, or it's in close proximity to those food contact surfaces and may come in contact with them. So any contamination that might be introduced as a part of clothing is going to be a major risk factor as you think about how your clothing touches or comes in close proximity to those food contact surfaces. And then footwear, of course, anytime that a worker moves throughout the farm, there's an opportunity for that contamination to be spread through that footwear. Hands, of course, are a big one. They play a major role in either preventing or introducing contamination on the farm. So when you think about how workers use their hands on the farm, oftentimes we're going to be directly touching produce or touching those food contact surfaces. And so if hands are not cleaned properly, and often, of course, they can be a major role in contamination. Of course, illness and injury, if workers, like we said, are harboring those foodborne illnesses or pathogens, or they may have some kind of bloodborne disease, whether if they're injured, there's a possibility of introducing that into the environment. And then, of course, hands and tools are closely related, right? Because these tools are going to be those food contact surfaces that our hands are going to be touching. They're going to be laid on food contact surfaces. So there's the opportunity to introduce and spread contamination in our hands and tools and equipment. So first, I talked about hands a lot, but this is probably one of the most important ways to prevent contamination from spreading throughout the farm. So let's talk about hands first. Workers must wash hands properly using soap and water for 20 seconds, and then use a single-use towel to dry those hands properly. It's important to note that hand sanitizer is not a substitute for proper hand washing. So anytime hand sanitizer is used, if there's any kind of dirt or organic matter, it can render that sanitizer ineffective. And so that sanitizer didn't have the chance to penetrate and reduce those microbial populations on your hands. And this is why it's important to wash your hands first if you are using hand sanitizer, because washing your hands gives that mechanical action mixed with that detergent to be able to lift the soil and organic matter off your hands. And then you'll follow up with that sanitizer to reduce the remaining bacterial populations. And so it's important to make sure your workers know they must wash their hands after using the toilet, before and after returning to work, or before starting or returning to work, before and after eating or smoking, before putting on gloves, and any other time where their hands may become contaminated. It's also important that workers know how to properly wash their hands. So everybody has different levels of personal hygiene and what they find is important, but it's important to impress upon workers that proper hand washing is of the utmost importance while they're on the farm and conducting any kind of produce related activities. So first, you want to train your workers on wetting their hands with water, of course, applying soap and lathering with that mechanical action of rubbing your hands together and making sure you're covering all sides and in between fingers with that soap for at least 20 seconds. A lot of times people will say sing happy birthday twice or sing their ABCs in order to make sure that they are reaching that 20-second mark. After reaching that 20-second mark, you'll want to rinse your hands thoroughly, including making sure you get up around your wrist area. And then dry hands with a single-use towel and use that towel then to turn off that faucet. And that towel is going to be that barrier to make sure that there's no contamination introduced onto your hands after you wash them. And then, of course, discard the towel in a trash can. So you can see on the right-hand side of my screen, there's a graphic here courtesy of Michigan State. There are many graphics and signs available to post in and around your hand washing stations to remind workers the importance of washing their hands properly and reaching that 20-second mark to let us remove not only that organic matter, but bacterial populations before starting work and any time where their hands might be contaminated. So the next is the use of toilets and portalets. Workers must always use the toilet for urination and defecation. And to some, this may seem like it should go without saying. However, in certain countries where workers may be from, this is not always the standard. The other standard that may be different depending on where your workers are from is that all toilet paper must be disposed of in the toilet, not in a trash can nearby, only in the toilet. And this is because in some Latin American countries and Africa and other places, the public sewage systems are not capable of handling toilet paper. However, in the United States, we don't have this problem. And so it's really important to manage contamination, to make sure that your workers are disposing that toilet paper in the toilet. And you can see on the right-hand side, I believe Cornell University has these posters and signage available for purchasing. And this is just to reinforce the idea that workers absolutely must use that toilet to do any urination and defecation, and then also must discard that toilet paper in that toilet. So when in operation, restrooms must be checked at least once daily to ensure that they are fully stocked and functioning properly to support these food safety principles that are required of your workers. So next is worker clothing and footwear. And we've talked about this a little bit, but it's important to understand how our clothes and footwear can become in close proximity or close contact with our food contact surfaces, or often can be considered food contact surfaces. So it's important that your workers should wear clean clothes and maintain footwear, as well as practice good hygiene when they come to work. If gloves are worn, workers must practice proper hand washing before donning gloves, and then change or clean gloves as needed. The importance of gloves that people don't really understand. A lot of consumers want to see workers using gloves on the farm. And a lot of the audits that some growers may be complying with will actually require gloves. But it's important to make sure that gloves are managed properly, because if a worker does not wash their hands properly, there's still some moisture and some contamination on their hands, and then they don those gloves and wear them for a couple hours. Those gloves may be torn, or there may be issues where they become worn very thin and then have the opportunity to tear. And then, of course, there was a nice environment, a nice warm environment with organic matter and possible situations where bacteria may have multiplied during that time of wearing those gloves. And so once they become torn, then it's just inoculating or contaminating any place that worker touches. And so if you do have gloves worn on your operation, I encourage you to manage these properly and make sure your workers know they must wash their hands properly before putting those gloves on. And then, of course, workers should remove and store all aprons, gloves, and other food safety equipment before using the restroom or conducting activities where those clothing or equipment may become contaminated. So we always remind people it's a good idea to hang like hooks or certain things outside the bathroom so that your workers can hang their aprons up there. Have a designated space where they can turn in or store any kind of equipment before using the restroom or conducting any activities where contamination can occur. There's also signage available. So the source is Amazon here, but you can get signage to make sure that you're reminding workers that they can't wear their aprons outside. They can't use certain equipment past a certain point. There's definitely signage available to help you support your food safety policies. And then worker illness and injury is another opportunity that we've talked about where workers may contaminate produce. So sick or injured workers can contaminate produce through bodily fluids. Any workers who are showing signs of foodborne illness must not handle fresh produce or be in those covered those areas where produce may have food contact surfaces or is handled. Symptoms to look out for include nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, and jaundice. The health department has a nice little sign that you can print out to remind your workers of what the foodborne illness symptoms are. And then, of course, you want to make sure you have a policy to support your workers if they do report any signs of foodborne illness, that they may be excluded from any produce handling activities. Also, if a worker becomes injured, the first step, of course, is to attend to your worker, stop all of the activities that are going on, clean and bandage all wounds. If the injury is on the hands, use the glove to create a double barrier. And I see, Walker, I believe you have a question.
Oh, yes, I have a question. If a worker's bodily fluids happen to touch produce, do you think it is okay to wash the produce and keep it?
So at that point, that produce would be considered adulterated and it would not be able to be washed. You would want to discard that produce properly. And so actually the next step, which applies to injury or illness if bodily fluids were to contact produce, is to discard any produce that may have become contaminated. Often people will take the next step and really be very proactive about removing more produce than what they think might be contaminated just to be safe. But certainly it will determine, you'll need a risk assessment to determine what produce may have been contaminated. And then to answer your question, it would have to be discarded. It is not able to be washed and then enter the food chain. Okay. So after you determine which produce may be contaminated, you will then want to identify the surfaces that may be contaminated and clean and sanitize those after a worker is injured, and then report injuries according to the company policy. And Taquasha, I think you might have a question. I think you might be on mute, Taquasha.
What are some of the foodborne illness that employees and supervisors should be aware of? I noticed you have like the spread of it, but what are some of the symptoms?
Yeah, so anytime an employee is displaying symptoms of nausea, maybe they're dizzy, they just don't feel well, maybe they are having gastrointestinal issues like vomiting or diarrhea, that would certainly be an indication that worker may be experiencing foodborne illness. Any kind of fever or jaundice would also be an indication. Oftentimes with hepatitis A, jaundice is the symptom that presents, and that is an indication of like liver issues, which hepatitis A is related to. Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Taylor.
You're welcome. Okay, so after we've managed our worker illness and injury, we are going to move on to visitors. So oftentimes we may have visitors who come to our farms, whether they be from allied industry or they're there for an educational purpose. Visitors must be made aware of farm food safety policies and have access to toilet and hand washing facilities. So a lot of farms have elected to have a visitor sign-in sheet, which spells out any farm food safety policies which relate to that visitor. And then they'll also introduce the location of those toilet and hand washing facilities. Another area or type of farm that we see a lot of visitors at are U-Picks. And U-Picks are a great way of educating consumers of farming practices and can also provide an alternate income source. It's a great way to engage consumers about the importance of food safety if you do have a U-Pick. But it's important, again, to provide fully stocked toilet and hand washing facilities. And it's a really great opportunity to talk to your visitors about the food safety policies that you have in place to keep them safe, and then what is expected of them while they're on your farm. So some people often post signage, which reminds visitors of farm food safety policies, the signage on hand washing, illness and injury, so that they know that what's expected of them while they're at your farm. But some also make it an educational event. So they may have a video about what their farm food safety policies are, and then an introduction to those policies that relate to the visitors at the end of the video. So there's different ways to educate your consumers on what's expected while they're there. But certainly these consumers are going to be doubling as food workers. And so it's important to make sure that they understand the importance of food safety while they're visiting the farm. So we've talked about the principles of food safety concerning workers and how contamination may be introduced into the environment. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about worker training. So we know that it's important to train our workers because fresh produce receives no additional processing steps before it reaches the consumer. So everything that happens to that produce along the supply chain can have a cumulative effect, and there's no opportunity to reduce that contamination after it's already happened. So again, workers are often our first line of defense in preventing food safety issues. And so if they're educated on those food safety issues and how to prevent them, then they are going to be, again, that first line of defense to help us prevent, to identify risks and then mitigate those risks on the farm. And of course, training is necessary to ensure workers understand how to identify and reduce those risks to prevent contamination. But it's also important to recognize that food safety is a company-wide task. So any owners, managers, and supervisors, while they may be an important part of making company policies, they also need to be an important part of using those company policies in their actions and day-to-day work. So they are really the ones that set the example. And so it's important that they are setting the example to workers to reinforce those policies that they deem are important. So what must workers be trained on? So the produce safety rule for workers, for farms who are covered by the produce safety rule, there are 3 different things that workers training must include. The first is principles of food hygiene and food safety. The second is the importance of personal hygiene and how to recognize those foodborne illness symptoms that we talked about. And then the third is any training that is relevant to the worker's job. So workers who conduct harvest, there's additional training that they must be trained on how to recognize contamination in the field, not to pick or harvest any produce that is identified to be contaminated. And then also if produce is dropped, then not to harvest that produce. And this does not apply to produce that is generally grown on the ground. It's that actual dropping which may cause an injury to that produce and then would support microbiological growth in that injury. So when must workers be trained? So again, farms who are covered by the produce safety rule requires workers who are supervising, handling covered produce be trained before starting work or at least once annually. So everyone needs to be trained on those 3 things that we talked about in the previous slide before they start work. And then they also need to be retrained at least once annually. Additionally, if farms are complying with the produce safety rule, section 122.22C of the PSR requires that at least one supervisor or responsible party for each covered farm must successfully complete food safety training, at least equivalent to the standardized curriculum recognized as adequate by FDA. And currently, the curriculum that's recognized as adequate by FDA is the Produce Safety Alliance Grower Training. Okay, and so once we know what our workers must be trained on, we also want to make sure that we're writing it down. And so there's other records that are also required by the produce safety rule, but they're also a good agricultural practice to maintain these records to ensure that the activities that and policies that you have set in place on your farm are being conducted. And so the first record that is required by the produce safety rule, but also a good idea to keep, is the monitoring and restocking of toilet and hand washing stations. And this record should include the date and time, name or initials of the recorder, and what activities were performed. So if toilet paper is restocked, of course, that worker would denote that on the record, sign and date it with their name. The other record is worker training records, which we talked about extensively, but it should include worker names and signatures, training topics covered, date and time, and then the name of the trainer who conducted the training. On the right-hand side is a template that is provided by the Produce Safety Alliance, which can actually be changed to meet the farm's needs. But you can see the basic topics that are covered in that record. And then, of course, illness and injury reports and restocking of first aid kits can be kept per company policy. So it's important that any growers or farms who are complying with the produce safety rule keep their records for at least 2 years. However, it's a good agricultural practice and it's a good idea to keep those records even if you are not complying with the produce safety rule. So these are the resources. I use the National Good Agricultural Practices Program and the Produce Safety Alliance website. And as Ashley stated, this work is supported by the USDA NEFA award for creating digestible content for growers.
Thank you so much, Taylor. Are there any other questions for our presenter before she leaves? All right, I've been monitoring the chat. It looks like everyone's understanding the presentation and everyone has now a better understanding of worker health and hygiene. So we just want to thank Taylor O'Bannon for coming and presenting to us today. And we just ask that you guys all have a great day. And thank you so much for attending.
Thanks, Ashley.